Machiavelli once wrote, "Each one sees what you appear to be, few really know what you are." I learned this lesson the hard way during my first corporate job at a tech startup in Austin back in 2018. I was 26, fresh out of college, and thought being authentic meant wearing my heart on my sleeve. I'd share my weekend plans, my dating struggles, even my financial worries with anyone who'd listen. I figured people would appreciate my honesty and see me as genuine. What I didn't realize was that my oversharing was actually undermining my professional credibility. While my colleagues smiled and nodded when I talked about my student loan anxiety or my messy breakup, they weren't seeing me as leadership material. They were seeing me as the guy who couldn't keep his personal life together. Meanwhile, my co-worker James, who seemed perpetually calm and collected, was getting invited to important meetings and strategy sessions that I wasn't even aware existed. The wake-up call came during my 6-month review with my manager Lisa. She told me I was doing good work, but lacked executive presence. When I pressed her for specifics, she explained that leadership meant projecting confidence and control, even when you don't feel it internally. She said, "People need to believe you can handle bigger responsibilities before they'll give them to you." That night, I went home and really thought about what she meant. I started observing James more carefully. He never complained about personal issues at work, never seemed flustered during tight deadlines, and always spoke as if he had everything under control. But I noticed something interesting during a company happy hour. When he thought no one was watching, I saw him checking his phone obsessively and looking genuinely stressed. He was just as anxious as the rest of us. He was simply better at managing his public persona. I decided to experiment with this approach. Instead of sharing my weekend party stories, I started mentioning books I was reading or industry podcasts that caught my attention. When projects got stressful, instead of venting about the impossible deadlines, I'd say things like, "It's a challenging timeline, but I'm confident we can make it work." I wasn't lying, I was just being selective about which truths I shared and when. The change in how people treated me was almost immediate. Within 2 months, I was included in client calls that were previously above my level. My manager started asking for my input on strategic decisions. When promotion time came around the following year, I got the raise and title bump that had seemed impossible just months before. The irony wasn't lost on me. By being less authentic in the traditional sense, I'd actually become more effective at achieving my authentic goals. But here's what really opened my eyes. I realized that everyone was already doing this to some degree. My manager, Lisa, who seemed so put together and authoritative, later confided that she suffered from severe imposter syndrome. The company CEO, who projected visionary confidence in all-hands meetings, was actually making many decisions based on educated guesses and hoping for the best. The difference was that successful people understood the game. They knew when to reveal vulnerability and when to project strength. I learned that authenticity isn't about sharing everything you think and feel. It's about being genuine within appropriate contexts. There's a time and place for vulnerability, but the workplace often isn't it. Your colleagues don't need to know about your dating life or financial stress, just like your romantic partner doesn't need to hear every detail about office politics. Managing your image isn't being fake. It's being strategic about which aspects of yourself serve your goals in different environments. The most successful people I've met since then all understand this principle instinctively. They craft their public personas carefully, not to deceive, but to emphasize the qualities that will help them succeed in specific contexts. They save their full, unfiltered selves for the people and situations where that level of openness serves them well. It's not manipulation, it's emotional intelligence applied strategically. Looking back, I realized that learning to control my professional image was just the beginning. Because once you understand how perception shapes reality in the workplace, you start noticing how this principle applies everywhere else in life. And that's when things get really interesting, especially when you discover how to become a mirror that reflects exactly what others need to see. Machiavelli understood that men judge more by the eyes than by the hands, for everyone can see, but few can feel. I discovered the truth of this during what I thought would be a routine client pitch in downtown Chicago last fall. Our marketing agency was competing for a major account with a luxury car dealership, and I was convinced our creative campaign was brilliant. We'd spent weeks crafting what we thought was the perfect strategy, full of innovative digital approaches and cutting-edge social media tactics. The meeting started poorly from minute one. Our contact, Richard Morrison, a 60-something dealership owner who'd built his business from nothing, kept checking his watch and seemed completely uninterested in our flashy presentation. I watched my colleague Sarah bulldoze ahead with our prepared pitch about millennial engagement strategies and authentic brand storytelling, while Richard's body language screamed boredom. By the 15-minute mark, I could see we were losing him completely, and I made a split-second decision that changed everything. I interrupted Sarah mid-sentence and said, "Mr. Morrison, before we continue, I'm curious. What's your biggest challenge right now with the business?" His entire demeanor shifted. For the next 10 minutes, he talked passionately about how younger salespeople didn't understand the importance of building genuine relationships with customers. He explained how his father had taught him that selling cars was really about understanding what made each customer feel confident and successful. He wanted to preserve that personal touch while still reaching younger buyers. Everything clicked for me in that moment. Richard wasn't interested in our trendy marketing concepts because they felt impersonal and disconnected from his core values. So I completely pivoted our approach. Instead of talking about brand engagement, I started discussing how we could help his salespeople tell better stories about customer success. Rather than pushing social media metrics, I focused on how digital tools could enhance, not replace, the personal relationships his team built with clients. I was literally mirroring back his own priorities and values, but through the lens of modern marketing. The transformation was remarkable. Richard leaned forward, started asking detailed questions, and began sharing stories about his most successful customer relationships. He wasn't just listening anymore. He was genuinely excited about our ideas because they reflected his own vision for his business. Sarah caught on quickly and started weaving Richard's language and concerns into her explanations. By the end of the meeting, we weren't selling him our campaign, we were collaborating on his vision. We won that contract, worth about $85,000, but more importantly, I learned something profound about human psychology. People don't want to be convinced, they want to be understood and validated. Richard had probably sat through dozens of agency pitches that focused on what the agencies thought was impressive, rather than what actually mattered to him. The moment I shifted from presenting our agenda to reflecting his priorities, the entire dynamic changed. This wasn't manipulation in a harmful sense. It was genuinely trying to understand what Richard needed, and then positioning our services as the solution to his actual problems. I wasn't pretending to care about relationship-based selling. I was discovering how our digital expertise could serve his authentic business philosophy. The best part was that our final campaign was actually stronger because it was grounded in real customer insights rather than generic marketing trends. I started applying this mirror technique everywhere. In job interviews, I'd listen carefully to what the interviewer valued most, whether it was innovation, stability, teamwork, or results, and then highlight those specific aspects of my experience. With friends going through relationship drama, instead of giving my opinion, I'd reflect back their own stated values and help them see how those applied to their situation. The key was authentic listening, not just waiting for my turn to talk. The pattern became clear. People are naturally drawn to those who make them feel heard and understood. When you can genuinely reflect someone's deeper motivations and concerns, you stop being just another person trying to convince them of something. You become someone who gets it, and that's incredibly powerful. But I also learned that this technique has to be authentic. People can sense when you're just parroting their words back without real understanding. What fascinated me most was how this mirroring approach actually made me better at my job. By focusing on truly understanding what clients needed rather than pushing my own ideas, I became more creative and effective. I wasn't losing myself in the process. I was becoming a better version of myself by developing genuine empathy and strategic thinking. The most successful people I know have mastered this balance between adapting to others while staying true to their core values. The really interesting part came later, when I realized that mastering the art of reflection was just the first step. Because once people see you as someone who truly understands them, they start opening up in ways that give you access to much more valuable information. And that's when I discovered the real power of strategic silence. Machiavelli knew that it is better to be feared than loved, but the ideal is to be respected in silence. I wish someone had taught me this principle before my disaster of a performance review in March 2020. I was working at a consulting firm in Denver, and I'd prepared extensively for my annual review with my director, Patricia. I had spreadsheets, testimonials, project summaries. I was ready to make my case for a promotion. The moment she asked how I thought I'd performed that year, I launched into a 15-minute monologue about every single accomplishment I could remember. Patricia sat there politely nodding while I rattled off project details, client feedback, and overtime hours I'd logged. I was so focused on selling myself that I completely missed the subtle cues she was giving me. Her slight frown when I mentioned the Johnson account, the way she shifted when I brought up the team leadership project. I was talking so much that I had no space to actually listen to what she might be trying to tell me. When I finally paused for breath, she simply said, "Well, you've certainly been busy," and moved on to discussing areas for improvement. The review didn't go the way I'd hoped. Instead of the promotion I was expecting, Patricia suggested I focus on developing better listening skills and strategic thinking. She mentioned that while my work quality was good, I seemed to struggle with reading situations and understanding the bigger picture. I left that meeting confused and frustrated, wondering how someone could criticize my listening skills when I just demonstrated how much I knew about everything happening in the office. It took a conversation with my mentor, David, to understand what had really happened. Over coffee the next week, he asked me a simple question. "During your review, what did you learn about Patricia's priorities for the department?" I realized with embarrassment that I couldn't answer. I'd been so busy talking about my achievements that I hadn't gathered any intelligence about what actually mattered to my boss or where the department was heading. David smiled and said, "That's exactly the problem." He told me about a technique he'd learned from a senior partner years earlier. In important conversations, especially with people who have power over your career, your job is to make them talk first and talk more. Ask questions, then shut up and really listen. People will tell you exactly what they value and what they're worried about if you give them space to do it. David explained that silence makes people uncomfortable, and they'll often fill that space with incredibly valuable information. I decided to test this approach during a client meeting the following month. Instead of jumping in with solutions the moment our client, Maria, finished describing her company's challenges, I simply nodded and asked, "What's been the most frustrating part of this situation for you personally?" Then I stayed quiet. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, Maria started talking about how the project delays were affecting her reputation with her own boss. She revealed budget constraints and political dynamics within her company that she'd never mentioned before. That single question and moment of silence gave me more useful information than 3 previous meetings combined. I learned that Maria was under pressure to show results quickly, that she had a difficult relationship with her company's IT department, and that she was personally invested in proving that bringing in external consultants was the right decision. Armed with this knowledge, I could position our services exactly as the solution to her specific pressures, not just her company's general problems. The transformation in how I conducted meetings was dramatic. I started asking more questions and talking less. When clients or colleagues made statements, I'd pause for a few seconds before responding, which often prompted them to elaborate or reveal additional details. During negotiations, I'd make my proposal and then remain completely silent until the other person responded. That silence created pressure that often worked in my favor. People would start negotiating against themselves or making concessions I hadn't even asked for. The most powerful moment came 6 months later, during my next review with Patricia. This time, I started by asking her what success looked like for our department over the next year. I asked about her biggest challenges and what kind of support she needed from her team. I spoke maybe 20% of the time, compared to my previous monologue approach. The difference was striking. Patricia opened up about budget pressures, Upcoming reorganizations and strategic initiatives I'd had no idea were in the works. By the end of that conversation, I had a complete roadmap for how to position myself for advancement. Patricia had essentially told me exactly what I needed to do to get promoted, which projects to focus on, and which skills to develop. More importantly, she'd done it while feeling heard and understood, rather than feeling like she was being sold to. 3 months later, I got the promotion I'd been wanting, along with a significant raise. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd gotten much better results by saying much less. I started noticing this pattern everywhere. The most influential people in meetings weren't usually the ones talking the most. They were the ones asking the right questions and then paying attention to the answers. They understood that information is power, and you can't gather information while your mouth is moving. Silence had become my secret weapon for understanding what really mattered to the people who mattered to me. But learning to use silence strategically was just the beginning, because once you understand how to gather information through quiet observation, you start recognizing opportunities that others miss entirely. And that's when I discovered how to turn problems into stepping stones. Machiavelli wrote, "A wise prince must, when he has the opportunity, skillfully nurture some enmity, so that by crushing it his greatness may grow even greater." I never understood the strategic value of crisis until our marketing agency in Portland faced what looked like a career-ending disaster in September 2021. Our biggest client, a regional restaurant chain called Pacific Plates, had just fired us after a social media campaign went viral for all the wrong reasons. The post we'd created, meant to be playful and trendy, was being torn apart online as tone-deaf and culturally insensitive. My business partner Jake was in full panic mode, pacing around our small office talking about damage control and crisis management. We'd lost 40% of our revenue overnight, and 2 other clients were already asking uncomfortable questions about our brand judgment. I spent the first day feeling sick to my stomach, watching our company's reputation get dragged through the mud on Twitter. But by the second day, something clicked in my mind. Instead of seeing this as a catastrophe, I started viewing it as an opportunity that our competitors didn't have access to. While Jake focused on defensive strategies and apology statements, I began crafting a completely different approach. I reached out to a diversity consultant named Angela Martinez, whom I'd met at a networking event months earlier. Instead of trying to minimize the situation, I asked her to help us conduct a complete audit of our practices and develop a comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategy for marketing agencies. I positioned this not as damage control, but as a genuine commitment to doing better that went far beyond what most agencies were willing to do. The key was timing and narrative control. Rather than waiting for the storm to pass, I proactively reached out to industry publications and offered to share our story as a case study in how agencies could learn from mistakes and implement real change. I scheduled interviews where I took full responsibility for our oversight, but more importantly, I outlined the specific steps we were taking to ensure it never happened again. I wasn't just apologizing, I was positioning our company as a leader in addressing an industry-wide problem. Within 3 weeks, something remarkable happened. The same industry publications that might have written us off as another agency that screwed up were instead featuring us as an example of how to handle crisis with integrity and forward-thinking leadership. Angela's audit revealed gaps in our processes that we'd never considered, and implementing her recommendations actually made us better at our jobs. We created new client onboarding procedures, cultural sensitivity checklists, and review processes that prevented future mistakes while improving our creative output. The real breakthrough came when I pitched this entire experience to a potential client, a tech startup called Responsive Systems. Their founder, Marcus, had been burned by his previous agency's careless approach to sensitive topics. Instead of hiding our recent controversy, I led with it. I explained how the Pacific Plates incident had forced us to develop the most rigorous cultural awareness processes in the city. I showed him our new protocols and introduced him to Angela, who was now consulting with us regularly. Marcus was impressed that we'd turned a failure into a competitive advantage rather than just trying to sweep it under the rug. He said most agencies would have either denied the problem or given him some generic diversity statement. But we could demonstrate actual systems and expertise that came from real experience, not just good intentions. We won that contract, worth about $60,000, specifically because of how we'd handled our crisis, not in spite of it. Over the next 6 months, our crisis-tested approach became a major selling point. We attracted clients who specifically wanted to work with an agency that had proven it could handle sensitive situations and learn from mistakes. Our revenue not only recovered, but exceeded where we'd been before the Pacific Plates incident. We'd transformed what could have been a company-ending disaster into a unique market position that our competitors couldn't replicate without going through their own crisis first. The lesson crystallized for me during a conference panel I was invited to speak on about crisis communication. The moderator asked how agencies could prepare for reputation disasters, and I realized that most people were thinking about crisis management all wrong. They were focused on minimizing damage and returning to the status quo rather than using the crisis as a catalyst for genuine improvement and competitive differentiation. Crisis wasn't something to survive. It was raw material for building something better. I started applying this principle to smaller challenges in business and life. When a key employee quit unexpectedly, instead of just replacing them, I used it as an opportunity to restructure responsibilities and create better career paths for remaining team members. When a client complained about our communication, instead of just apologizing, I developed a new project management system that became a selling point for future clients. Every problem became a chance to solve not just the immediate issue, but the underlying system that created it. What fascinated me most was how this approach changed people's perception of our competence. Clients and prospects began seeing us as a company that didn't just react to problems, but anticipated and solved them proactively. We weren't the agency that never made mistakes. We were the agency that turned mistakes into innovations. And that reputation opened doors that perfect execution alone never could have. But learning to capitalize on crisis was just one piece of a larger puzzle. Because once you understand how to turn disasters into opportunities, you start recognizing how every interaction is actually an exchange of value. And that's when the real strategy begins. Machiavelli observed that men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that he who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. I learned the true power of strategic generosity during my first year as a freelance consultant in Minneapolis back in 2019. I was struggling to build my client base, sending cold emails and making networking calls that led nowhere. I was approaching business like a transaction, trying to sell my services to anyone who would listen. Then I met Rebecca Chen at a coffee shop near the University of Minnesota, and she completely changed how I thought about building professional relationships. Rebecca was a marketing director at a mid-sized healthcare company, and we struck up a conversation while waiting in line at Spy House Coffee. Instead of pitching my consulting services, I simply listened as she vented about a data analytics problem her team was facing. She mentioned they were drowning in customer survey responses, but couldn't figure out how to extract actionable insights. I happened to have experience with exactly this type of analysis from my previous corporate job, so I offered to take a look at her data over the weekend, completely free, no strings attached. I spent about 6 hours that Saturday building a comprehensive analysis of their survey data, complete with visualizations and specific recommendations for improving customer retention. When I emailed Rebecca the report on Monday morning, I included a note saying I'd enjoyed the intellectual challenge and hoped the insights would be useful for her team. I didn't mention my consulting business or ask for anything in return. I genuinely wanted to help someone who seemed frustrated with a problem I knew how to solve. Rebecca was blown away by the quality and depth of the analysis. She immediately shared it with her senior management team, who were equally impressed. But more importantly, Rebecca felt genuinely grateful in a way that went beyond a normal business transaction. I'd given her something valuable, without being asked and without expecting payment. Over the next few weeks, she started mentioning my name in conversations with colleagues from other companies who had similar analytical challenges. Within 2 months, I had 3 new consulting contracts that came directly through Rebecca's referrals. These weren't cold prospects I had to convince. They were warm leads who already trusted me because someone they respected had vouched for my work. The total value of those contracts was about $45,000, all stemming from 6 hours of unpaid work I'd done on a Saturday. But the real payoff wasn't just financial. I discovered a completely different way to build business relationships. I started applying this give-first approach systematically. When I met people at networking events, instead of talking about what I could do for them, I'd ask about their biggest challenges and look for ways to help immediately. If someone mentioned they were hiring, I'd send them resumes from talented people in my network. If they were struggling with a vendor relationship, I'd introduce them to better alternatives I knew. If they needed expertise in an area I didn't cover, I'd connect them with specialists who could help. The key was making these gestures genuinely helpful rather than obviously transactional. I wasn't keeping a scorecard or immediately asking for favors in return. I was building what economists call social capital, a bank account of goodwill that I could draw from when the right opportunities arose. People started seeing me as someone who added value to their professional lives, rather than someone who was always trying to extract value from them. The most powerful example came about 8 months later, when I was competing for a major contract with a financial services firm in downtown Minneapolis. The decision-maker, Tom Bradley, mentioned during our initial meeting that his company was also looking for a new accounting firm. I happened to know an excellent CPA named Maria Santos, who specialized in financial services compliance. I introduced them the next week, and Maria's firm ended up saving Tom's company about $20,000 annually compared to their previous accountant. When it came time for Tom to choose a consultant for the original project I'd been pitching, the decision was essentially made before the formal presentation. He told me later that while my competitors had similar qualifications, I was the only one who had already demonstrated genuine interest in his company's success beyond just winning the contract. He felt confident that I would approach the consulting work with the same level of care and strategic thinking I'd shown in understanding his broader business needs. That contract was worth $75,000 and led to ongoing work that lasted nearly 2 years. But more importantly, it taught me that reciprocity isn't just about doing favors. It's about positioning yourself as someone who thinks strategically about other people's success. When you help someone solve problems they didn't even ask you to solve, you're demonstrating a level of business insight and genuine care that separates you from everyone else who's just trying to sell them something. I realized that the most successful people I knew all operated this way instinctively. They were constantly making introductions, sharing resources, and offering expertise without keeping detailed mental records of who owed them what. But they also understood that this generosity would eventually be rewarded, often in ways they couldn't predict or control. The key was being patient and strategic about when and how to make withdrawals from the goodwill bank account you'd built up. The fascinating part was how this approach changed my entire professional reputation. People started introducing me at events as someone who always knows the right person for whatever problem you're facing. I became known as a connector and problem solver, not just a consultant selling specific services. This reputation opened doors to opportunities that had nothing to do with my original expertise, simply because people trusted my judgment and wanted to include me in their networks. But understanding reciprocity was just the foundation for something much more sophisticated. Because once you know how to build goodwill strategically, you start recognizing the invisible networks that really control how decisions get made, and that's where the real power lies. Machiavelli understood that it is necessary to be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves. I learned this lesson the hard way when I thought I'd landed the perfect job opportunity in Seattle back in 2020. The position was VP of Strategy at a growing fintech startup called Nexus Financial, and everything seemed ideal during my interviews. The CEO, David Park, was impressive and visionary. The salary was exactly what I wanted. The role seemed tailor-made for my background. I was so focused on impressing the people in the room that I completely failed to map the real power dynamics within the company. My first red flag should have been during the final interview when I met Sarah Williams, who was introduced as the head of operations. She seemed pleasant enough, but I noticed that David deferred to her opinion on several strategic questions. and other team members paid careful attention to her reactions during the discussion. At the time, I assumed she was just a valued colleague. I didn't realize until much later that Sarah was actually David's former business partner, who had helped fund the company's early stages and still held significant equity and informal influence over major decisions. I accepted the position and started in January 2021, excited to implement the strategic initiatives David and I had discussed. But within my first month, I kept running into subtle resistance from various team members. Projects I thought had been approved were suddenly under review. Meetings I expected to lead were postponed indefinitely. People were polite but evasive when I asked for updates or resources. I couldn't understand why nothing was moving forward despite having clear support from the CEO. The breakthrough came during a casual conversation with Mike Torres, a software engineer who'd been with the company since the beginning. We were grabbing lunch at a Thai place near the office, and I mentioned my frustration with the slow pace of strategic implementation. Mike looked at me carefully and said, "Have you talked to Sarah about these initiatives?" When I explained that I'd been working directly with David, Mike's expression told me everything I needed to know. I'd been operating in the official org chart, while completely missing the unofficial power structure. Mike explained that while David was the public face of the company, Sarah essentially had veto power over any major strategic decisions. She'd been burned by a previous hire who had tried to change too much too quickly, and she was naturally cautious about new leadership bringing in outside ideas. More importantly, the three other senior managers, people I'd viewed as peers, were actually Sarah's longtime allies who looked to her for guidance on whether to support new initiatives. I'd been trying to build support horizontally when I should have been building it vertically through Sarah first. Armed with this intelligence, I completely changed my approach. Instead of pushing forward with my original strategic plans, I scheduled a one-on-one meeting with Sarah to understand her vision for the company's future. I asked about her biggest concerns and what she'd learned from previous strategic missteps. I discovered that she was worried about maintaining the company culture that had made them successful while scaling rapidly. She was also concerned about managing cash flow during expansion, something that hadn't come up in my interviews with David. I spent the next 2 weeks revising my strategic proposals to address Sarah's specific concerns. Instead of broad transformation initiatives, I focused on incremental improvements that would preserve company culture while building scalability. I made sure every proposal included detailed financial projections showing how we'd maintain cash flow stability. Most importantly, I positioned these changes as extensions of the successful foundation Sarah and David had already built, rather than departures from it. The transformation in workplace dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Once Sarah signaled her support for my revised approach, the other senior managers became enthusiastic collaborators instead of polite obstacles. Projects that had been stalled for weeks suddenly moved forward quickly. I had access to resources and information that had previously been unavailable. Within 3 months, we'd implemented strategic changes that improved operational efficiency by 30%, while actually reducing costs. But the real education came when I started paying attention to similar hidden power structures in client, companies, and industry relationships. I began mapping not just who held official titles, but who influenced those title holders. In client meetings, I'd watch carefully to see whose opinions carried the most weight, who people looked to for approval, and who had the ability to derail projects with a single skeptical comment. This intelligence became incredibly valuable for positioning proposals and building support for recommendations. I started keeping informal notes about these relationship maps, not in any manipulative way, but as genuine strategic intelligence that helped me be more effective in my role. I'd note that the chief marketing officer at one client company always checked with her longtime assistant before making budget decisions, or that the CEO of another firm consistently deferred to his brother-in-law, who officially held a minor operational role but had been with the company since its founding. Understanding these relationships allowed me to present ideas through the right channels and avoid political landmines. The most valuable insight was recognizing that every organization has multiple power structures operating simultaneously. There's the official hierarchy shown on org charts, the social influence network based on relationships and history, the expertise-based influence, where people defer to subject matter experts, and the informal coalition structure, where certain people consistently support each other's initiatives. Successful navigation required understanding all these layers, not just the surface-level reporting structure. This mapping approach extended beyond just workplace politics. I started applying the same analysis to industry conferences, professional associations, and even social situations. Before important networking events, I'd research not just who would be attending, but who knew whom, who had worked together previously, and who might have conflicting interests or competing agendas. This preparation allowed me to navigate conversations much more strategically and make connections that actually led to meaningful opportunities. But understanding alliance structures was just the beginning of a much deeper strategic capability. Because once you can see the hidden relationships that shape decisions, you start recognizing the information asymmetries that create the real advantages in any competitive situation. Machiavelli warned that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. I discovered the true power of superior information during what seemed like a routine real estate negotiation in Austin in early 2022. My wife and I were looking to buy our first house, and we'd fallen in love with a charming craftsman-style home in the Travis Heights neighborhood. Our realtor, Jessica, was competent, but seemed to approach the process like most agents do: find houses that match the criteria, schedule showings, and help with offers. What she didn't realize was that I'd been quietly gathering intelligence that would completely change our negotiating position. The house had been on the market for 43 days, which was unusual for that neighborhood where properties typically sold within 2 weeks. While Jessica focused on the listing details and comparable sales, I spent evenings researching everything I could find about the sellers and the property's history. I discovered through public records that the owners, Robert and Linda Chen, had purchased the house in 2018 and done extensive renovations. More importantly, I found their LinkedIn profiles and learned that Robert had recently accepted a job transfer to Denver, and they needed to relocate by the end of June. But the real goldmine of information came from a completely unexpected source. I was having coffee at a local shop called Radio Coffee, and I struck up a conversation with the barista, a college student named Tyler, who mentioned he lived in Travis Heights. When I casually mentioned we were looking at houses in the area, he said, "Oh, you mean like the one where the Chens are moving? My girlfriend's roommate works with Linda, and she's been stressed about the timeline." That one random conversation revealed that the sellers were under significant time pressure that wasn't reflected in their listing strategy. I dug deeper without being obvious about it. I checked the Travis County property tax records and discovered that the Chens had taken out a home equity loan in late 2021, suggesting they might have some financial pressure to sell quickly. I also found that their current mortgage was at a higher interest rate than what was available in the market, indicating they might not have the financial flexibility to carry 2 mortgages if the sale dragged out. Meanwhile, Jessica was preparing to offer full asking price because she thought the house was priced competitively for the neighborhood. Armed with this information asymmetry, I developed a completely different negotiation strategy. Instead of competing on price alone, I structured an offer that addressed the seller's real constraints. We offered $15,000 below asking price, but with a guaranteed close date of June 15th, exactly when Robert needed to start his new job in Denver. We also waived the inspection contingency and offered a rent-back agreement so they could stay in the house for 2 weeks after closing to manage their move timing. The sellers accepted our offer within 6 hours, even though they'd received 2 other offers at higher prices. When I asked Jessica why our offer won, she said Linda had told her, "These buyers understand what we actually need." The truth was that we'd solved their real problem, timing and certainty, rather than just offering the most money. Our information advantage had saved us $15,000 while actually making our offer more attractive to the sellers than higher-priced alternatives. This experience opened my eyes to how information asymmetry creates opportunities everywhere, not just in real estate. I started applying the same research approach to business situations. Before client meetings, I'd researched not just the company's public information, but the backgrounds of key decision makers, recent industry pressures they were facing, and any operational challenges mentioned in trade publications or local business journals. This intelligence allowed me to position proposals that addressed their unstated concerns, not just their official requirements. The most dramatic example came 6 months later, when I was competing for a consulting contract with a regional bank called First Community Financial. While my competitors focused on their standard capabilities presentations, I discovered through industry research that the bank was facing regulatory pressure to improve their anti-money laundering compliance systems. This wasn't mentioned in their RFP, but I'd found references to it in recent regulatory filings and local business news articles about banking industry challenges. I structured my entire proposal around compliance-focused solutions, even though they'd only asked for general operational consulting. During the presentation, when I mentioned specific AML regulations and recent enforcement trends, the bank president's reaction told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't expected any consultant to understand their regulatory pressures without being told explicitly. We won that contract worth $85,000 specifically because we demonstrated knowledge of problems they hadn't even articulated yet. The pattern became clear across every area of life. Information asymmetry creates leverage in negotiations, relationships, and strategic planning. People make decisions based on incomplete information, and whoever has the missing pieces can predict and influence outcomes with remarkable accuracy. The key was learning where to look for intelligence that others either couldn't access or wouldn't think to gather. Public records, industry publications, social media, casual conversations, and professional networks all contained valuable data points that most people overlooked. I developed a systematic approach to information gathering before any important interaction. I'd research the people involved, their backgrounds and motivations, recent changes in their industry or personal circumstances, and any pressures or opportunities they might be facing. This wasn't corporate espionage. It was strategic due diligence using publicly available information that most people were too lazy or unimaginative to compile. The investment of time in research consistently paid dividends in better outcomes, but perhaps the most valuable insight was recognizing that information asymmetry isn't just about having more facts than the other person. It's about having more relevant facts, data that actually impacts the decision-making process in ways that surface-level information doesn't reveal. Understanding someone's timeline pressures, financial constraints, career motivations, or regulatory concerns gives you insight into what they really need, not just what they say they want. The fascinating part was how this approach changed people's perception of my competence and trustworthiness. When you demonstrate understanding of someone's situation that goes beyond what they've explicitly shared, they start seeing you as unusually insightful and strategic. This reputation creates opportunities for deeper relationships and more significant collaborations, but it also revealed something even more powerful about human psychology and the stories we tell ourselves. Machiavelli understood that victory is not just defeating the enemy, but making everyone believe your cause was just from the beginning. I learned the power of narrative control during what should have been a career-ending mistake at my marketing consultancy in San Francisco in late 2021. We'd been working with a tech startup called Velocity Apps on their product launch, and I'd made a critical error in their paid advertising campaign that cost them about $12,000 in wasted ad spend over a weekend. By Monday morning, their founder, Marcus Rodriguez, was furious, threatening to fire us and demand a full refund. My business partner, Sarah, was in crisis mode, drafting apology emails and calculating how much we could afford to reimburse them. I spent Sunday night feeling sick about the mistake, but something clicked when I was reviewing exactly what had gone wrong. The error had happened because Velocity's product specifications had changed 3 times during the campaign setup, and our standard approval process hadn't caught the final version. While the mistake was ultimately ours, the context revealed a larger problem with how tech startups typically managed marketing launches. Instead of leading with an apology, I called Marcus first thing Monday morning and said, "I need to share something important with you about what happened this weekend." because it reveals a systemic problem that could cost you much more than $12,000 if we don't address it. That opening completely changed the trajectory of the conversation. Instead of starting with our failure, I'd positioned the discussion around a bigger threat to his business that we'd uncovered through our mistake. I explained that the advertising error had exposed gaps in how his team was communicating product changes to external partners. I showed him email timestamps proving that critical specifications had been updated Friday afternoon, but not communicated to our team until after the ads were already running. Then I connected this to broader risks. What would happen when they scaled and had multiple vendors, partners, or team members working with outdated information? The $12,000 mistake became evidence of a communication system that could cost them hundreds of thousands as they grew. Marcus's entire demeanor shifted from anger to concern. Instead of focusing on punishing us for the error, he started asking questions about how to prevent similar miscommunications in the future. I proposed that we use this incident as a case study to develop better project management protocols that would benefit both our companies. We'd document exactly what went wrong, create new approval checkpoints, and implement communication systems that would prevent similar issues with any future vendors or partners. By the end of that conversation, Marcus was thanking me for identifying a critical operational weakness before it became a bigger problem. We not only kept the client, but he agreed to pay for an additional consulting project to overhaul their vendor communication systems. The narrative had completely flipped. We weren't the agency that had screwed up. We were the strategic partner who had identified and solved a fundamental business risk. That additional project was worth $18,000, more than covering the original advertising mistake. The lesson crystallized for me during a team debrief the following week. Sarah asked how I'd managed to turn an angry client into an enthusiastic collaborator, and I realized it was all about narrative framing, the same set of facts. Our advertising error, their communication gaps, the financial loss, could be told as a story of vendor incompetence or as a story of strategic partnership and operational improvement. The difference was which story I chose to lead with and how I positioned the various elements. I started applying this narrative control technique to smaller situations. When a project was running behind schedule, instead of reporting delays, I'd frame updates around strategic pivots based on new market intelligence. When clients requested changes that would increase costs, I'd position these as optimization opportunities that will improve ROI. I wasn't lying about the facts, but I was controlling how those facts were interpreted and what they meant for the overall success of the project. The most powerful example came 6 months later when we were competing for a major contract with a retail company called Pacific Coast Markets. During the presentation, their CMO, Lisa Park, asked about our experience with companies in their specific industry vertical. Honestly, we had very limited retail experience, which could have been seen as a significant weakness. Instead of minimizing this gap, I positioned it as a strategic advantage. I explained that retail marketing had become insular and repetitive because most agencies only hired people with retail backgrounds, creating an echo chamber of similar ideas. Our diverse client experience across tech, healthcare, and professional services meant we could bring fresh perspectives and proven strategies from other industries that their retail-focused competitors would never consider. We weren't inexperienced in retail. We were innovatively cross-pollinated with insights that pure retail agencies couldn't access. Lisa was intrigued rather than concerned. She said later that while other agencies had presented standard retail marketing approaches, we'd offered a unique value proposition that could differentiate Pacific Coast from their competitors. We won that contract worth $95,000 specifically because I'd reframed our apparent weakness as a distinctive strength. The narrative I'd constructed made our limitation feel like their opportunity. This experience taught me that narrative control isn't about manipulation or deception. It's about choosing which true story to tell and how to tell it most effectively. Every situation contains multiple valid narratives depending on which facts you emphasize, which context you provide, and which outcomes you focus on. The person who gets to frame the story usually controls how others interpret and respond to the situation. I began studying how successful leaders, politicians, and business figures used narrative control in their communications. They rarely denied problems or mistakes, but they consistently positioned challenges within larger stories of growth, learning, and strategic advantage. They understood that people don't just process information. They process stories that give meaning and context to information. Controlling the narrative meant controlling the meaning people extracted from events. The most sophisticated part was learning to embed narrative frames so naturally that people didn't realize they were being guided towards specific interpretations. When I presented quarterly business reviews to clients, I'd structure the data within stories of market evolution, competitive positioning, and strategic foresight. The numbers were always accurate, but the story I told about what those numbers meant shaped how clients felt about our performance and their future needs. But mastering narrative control revealed something even more fundamental about human psychology. Because once you understand how stories shape perception, you start recognizing the crucial importance of managing expectations before those stories even begin to unfold. Machiavelli knew that it is much safer to be feared than loved, but one must avoid being hated. I learned this principle the hard way during my first major consulting project in Boston back in 2020. I was working with a logistics company called Northeast Supply Chain, and I was so eager to impress them that I promised the moon during our initial meetings. I told CEO Patricia Reynolds that we could improve their operational efficiency by 40% within 3 months, reduce costs by at least 30%, and implement a complete digital transformation of their warehouse management system. I thought I was demonstrating confidence and ambition, but I was actually setting myself up for failure. The project started well enough. My team identified several quick wins in their inventory management processes, and we implemented some automation, tools that showed immediate improvements. But by the 6-week mark, it became clear that the 40% efficiency gain I'd promised was wildly unrealistic, given their existing infrastructure and staff capabilities. The digital transformation was taking much longer than anticipated, because their legacy systems were more complex than I'd initially assessed. Instead of being seen as a strategic visionary, I was starting to look like someone who made promises he couldn't keep. Patricia called me into her office 8 weeks into the project with a concerned expression that I'll never forget. She said, "David, your team is doing good work, but we're nowhere near the results you promised. I'm starting to wonder if we hired the right consultant." I realized in that moment that my overly ambitious promises had created a narrative of underperformance, even though we were actually making solid progress. The gap between expectations and reality was undermining all the genuine value we were delivering. I had to completely reset the relationship. I scheduled a comprehensive project review meeting and took full responsibility for overpromising in the initial proposal. But instead of just apologizing, I repositioned our achievements within more realistic expectations. I showed Patricia that the 15% efficiency improvement we'd achieved was actually exceptional for a company of their size and complexity. I presented industry benchmarks proving that most similar projects took 18 to 24 months to achieve the kind of transformation I'd promised in 3 months. The key was reframing our progress as ahead of schedule rather than behind expectations. I explained that the thorough analysis we'd done of their legacy systems, while time-consuming, would prevent much more expensive problems later in the implementation. The delays in digital transformation were actually strategic decisions to ensure long-term stability and scalability. By the end of that meeting, Patricia was relieved rather than disappointed. She felt like her investment was being managed carefully rather than rushed irresponsibly. This experience completely changed how I approached client relationships. For my next major project with a healthcare company called Mountain View Medical, I took the opposite approach. During our initial discussions with their COO, Michael Torres, I consistently understated what we could accomplish and overstated how long it would take. When he asked about potential cost savings, I said we'd aim for 10 to 15% improvements, while privately believing we could achieve 25% or more. The psychological effect was remarkable. Because my promises were modest and realistic, Michael felt confident that we could deliver on our commitments. There was no anxiety about whether we'd meet expectations because the bar was set at an achievable level. This allowed me to focus entirely on execution rather than managing disappointment. When we achieved 18% cost savings in the first quarter, instead of the promised 10 to 15%, Michael was thrilled rather than relieved. 6 months later, when we'd consistently exceeded every milestone and timeline I'd outlined, Michael told me, "This is the first consulting project where I haven't spent half my time worrying about whether you guys were going to deliver what you promised." He said the experience had been so positive that he was already planning to bring us back for additional projects. That contract turned into ongoing work worth over $200,000, largely because I'd managed expectations strategically from the beginning. I started applying this under-promise, over-deliver approach to every aspect of my business and personal life. When potential clients asked about project timelines, I'd add 20% buffer time to my actual estimates. When discussing potential outcomes, I'd focus on conservative scenarios while privately working toward stretch goals. This approach eliminated the stress of constantly trying to meet unrealistic expectations while creating consistent opportunities to pleasantly surprise people. The most powerful application came during a partnership negotiation with a technology company called Adaptive Systems. Their CEO, Jennifer Walsh, was considering our proposal for a joint venture that could potentially generate significant revenue for both companies. Instead of pitching optimistic projections, I focused on worst-case scenarios and minimum viable outcomes. I explained exactly what could go wrong, how we'd handle various challenges, and what the partnership would look like if everything went worse than expected. Jennifer later told me that she'd been burned by previous partnerships where consultants had oversold potential benefits and undercommunicated risks. She said my realistic approach gave her confidence that I understood the actual complexities involved and wouldn't disappear when challenges arose. We structured the partnership with conservative financial projections, and when it exceeded those projections by 40% in the first year, both companies felt like they'd discovered unexpected value rather than met expected returns. The psychological principle behind this approach became clear through repeated experience. People are naturally loss-averse. They feel the pain of disappointment much more intensely than the pleasure of exceeding expectations. When you consistently deliver more than promised, you create a pattern of positive surprises that builds trust and enthusiasm. When you overpromise and underdeliver, even by small margins, you create anxiety and disappointment that undermines everything else you accomplish. This expectation management strategy also created a competitive advantage in business development. While other consultants were making grand promises to win contracts, I was building reputation for reliability and conservative wisdom. Clients started referring me to colleagues specifically because they knew I wouldn't overpromise or create unrealistic expectations. My approach attracted clients who valued strategic thinking over flashy presentations, and those relationships tended to be more profitable and longer lasting. But managing expectations was just one component of a more comprehensive approach to professional relationships. Because once you understand how to consistently exceed what people expect from you, you start recognizing how to handle the inevitable conflicts and challenges that threaten those relationships. Machiavelli wrote, "If you cannot defeat your enemy, join him. If you cannot join him, destroy him. If you cannot destroy him, ignore him until he destroys himself." I discovered the wisdom of this approach during what felt like a professional assassination attempt in Denver back in 2022. I was working as a strategy consultant, and one of my colleagues, Kevin Walsh, had been systematically undermining my reputation with clients and senior management. He'd been spreading doubts about my competence, questioning my recommendations in meetings, and positioning himself as the more reliable alternative whenever major projects came up. The situation came to a head during a client presentation with Rocky Mountain Financial, a regional investment firm we'd been courting for months. I'd spent weeks preparing a comprehensive analysis of their operational inefficiencies, complete with detailed recommendations and implementation timelines. But during the presentation, Kevin kept interrupting with concerns about my approach, suggesting that my recommendations were too aggressive and might destabilize their existing systems. He was essentially sabotaging my pitch while appearing to be a thoughtful team player, raising legitimate questions. After the meeting, our managing director, Susan Martinez, pulled me aside and said the client had expressed reservations about moving forward with my proposal. Kevin's devil's advocate questions had planted enough doubt that Rocky Mountain Financial was now considering a more conservative approach, which happened to align perfectly with Kevin's preferred methodology. I realized that if I tried to confront Kevin directly or complain to management about his tactics, I'd look paranoid and unprofessional. I needed a more sophisticated response. Instead of attacking Kevin, I decided to neutralize him by making him a stakeholder in my success. The next week, I scheduled a meeting with him and said, "Kevin, I've been thinking about your concerns regarding the Rocky Mountain project, and I think you're right that we need a more collaborative approach. I'd like you to co-lead the implementation phase with me." I positioned this as recognizing his expertise rather than managing his hostility, and I made sure to copy Susan on the email confirming our partnership. Kevin was caught completely off guard. He couldn't refuse the opportunity to co-lead a major project without looking uncooperative, but accepting meant he'd be responsible for the success or failure of the very recommendations he'd been criticizing. More importantly, if the project succeeded, he'd have to share credit with me. If it failed, he'd share the blame. Either way, he could no longer undermine the project without undermining himself. The psychological transformation was fascinating to watch. Once Kevin became invested in making my recommendations work, he stopped looking for problems and started looking for solutions. His critical nature, which had been directed against me, was now focused on external obstacles to our shared success. He began defending our approach to the client with the same energy he'd previously used, to attack it. Within 6 weeks, we'd not only won the Rocky Mountain contract, but Kevin had become one of my most effective advocates. But the real lesson came 3 months later, when I faced a different type of threat. A new hire named Angela Rodriguez had joined our team with impressive credentials and clear ambitions to establish herself quickly. Instead of waiting for her to potentially challenge my position, I proactively offered to mentor her and include her in my most important client relationships. I introduced her to key contacts, shared my project management systems, and positioned her success as evidence of my leadership capabilities. This preemptive alliance building paid off when Susan announced that the company was restructuring and one of the senior consultant positions might be eliminated. Instead of competing against Angela for resources and client relationships, I'd created a situation where her success supported my value to the organization. She became my advocate in senior management discussions, emphasizing how my mentorship had accelerated her contributions to the team. The position that was eventually eliminated belonged to a different consultant who had treated Angela as competition rather than an ally. The most sophisticated application of this principle came when I was dealing with a client who seemed determined to make my life difficult. Harrison Tech's CTO, Michael Chen, had hired our consulting firm reluctantly after pressure from his CEO, and he made it clear that he didn't believe external consultants could understand his company's technical challenges. He questioned every recommendation, demanded excessive documentation, and generally created obstacles that made productive work nearly impossible. Rather than trying to prove Michael wrong or complain about his resistance, I repositioned him as the expert and myself as the student. I scheduled regular meetings where I asked detailed questions about his technical systems and challenged him to identify flaws in my understanding. I started presenting recommendations as hypotheses that needed his validation rather than conclusions that challenged his expertise. I made him the hero of every success story rather than positioning myself as the consultant who'd solved his problems. This approach completely changed our dynamic. Michael's resistance transformed into engagement because I was validating his expertise rather than threatening it. He began volunteering information and insights that he'd previously withheld, which allowed me to develop much more effective solutions. By the end of the project, Michael was telling his CEO that I was the most knowledgeable consultant he'd worked with, specifically because I demonstrated respect for his technical knowledge and experience. The pattern became clear across different types of threats and conflicts. Direct confrontation usually escalated problems and created win-lose scenarios that damaged relationships even when you won. But strategic inclusion, repositioning, and alliance building could transform adversaries into advocates without compromising your core objectives. The key was understanding what motivated the other person and finding ways to align their interests with yours. This approach required genuine emotional intelligence and patience. It would have been easier to complain about Kevin's sabotage or Michael's resistance, but those defensive responses would have weakened my position while strengthening theirs. By taking responsibility for managing the relationship dynamics strategically, I'd maintained control over outcomes while actually building stronger professional networks. The most valuable insight was recognizing that most workplace conflicts stem from people feeling threatened, unrecognized, or excluded rather, than genuine disagreements about objectives or methods. When you can address those underlying concerns through inclusion and recognition, you often discover that apparent enemies become powerful allies. But this principle of neutralizing threats was just one component of a larger strategic framework that required always maintaining multiple options. Machiavelli understood that fortune helps the bold, but abandons the reckless. Always keep two paths open. I learned this lesson during what felt like the most secure period of my career in Portland back in 2021. I was the lead strategy consultant at a successful firm called Pacific Northwest Solutions, pulling in great money, working with interesting clients, and seemingly on track for a partnership position. I'd gotten comfortable, maybe even a little complacent, focusing all my energy on proving myself within that single organization. I thought loyalty and specialization were my path to success, but I was actually making myself dangerously vulnerable. The wake-up call came on a Thursday morning in March when our managing partner, Robert Kim, called an emergency all-hands meeting. He announced that our largest client, representing about 60% of the firm's revenue, had decided to bring their consulting work in-house effective immediately. The company was downsizing by 40%, and partnership positions were being frozen indefinitely. In one meeting, my career trajectory went from promising to precarious, and I realized I'd put all my professional eggs in one very fragile basket. While my colleagues panicked about layoffs and started updating resumes frantically, I had a different problem. I'd been so focused on internal advancement that I'd neglected to build external options. My network was mostly internal to the firm, my skills were specialized to our specific methodologies, and I had no active relationships with other consulting companies or potential clients. I'd optimized for success within one system without preparing for what would happen if that system failed. That weekend, I made a hard decision. Instead of just hoping to survive the downsizing, I started systematically building alternative paths before I actually needed them. I reached out to former colleagues who'd moved to other firms, started attending industry networking events I'd previously skipped, and began developing expertise in areas that weren't central to my current role, but were valuable in the broader market. I wasn't planning to leave Pacific Northwest Solutions, but I was making sure I could leave if circumstances required it. The most important move was reconnecting with Maria Santos, a former colleague who'd started her own boutique consulting practice 2 years earlier. Over coffee at Stumptown, I casually mentioned that I was interested in doing some freelance work on weekends to expand my skill set. Maria had been struggling to handle all the demand for her services, and she offered to subcontract some smaller projects to me. Within 6 weeks, I was earning an extra $2,000 monthly while developing expertise in digital transformation consulting that my main job didn't provide. This side work became my insurance policy. When the layoffs came 8 months later, I wasn't caught off guard like my colleagues. Pacific Northwest Solutions offered me a generous severance package to encourage voluntary departures, and I was able to accept it confidently because I already had income alternatives in place. Maria immediately offered to increase my project load, and 2 other firms I'd been cultivating relationships with extended job offers. Instead of desperately searching for employment, I was choosing between opportunities. But the real revelation came when I decided to turn down all the job offers and go independent. The combination of Maria's subcontract work, a small client I developed through networking, and the financial runway from my severance package gave me the confidence to start my own practice. I wasn't jumping off a cliff. I was stepping from one stable platform to another. Within a year, my independent consulting income exceeded what I'd been making at Pacific Northwest Solutions, and I had the flexibility to pursue opportunities that employed consultants couldn't access. The experience taught me to apply this multiple options thinking to every aspect of my professional life. When I started dating seriously, I made sure to maintain strong friendships and personal interests outside the relationship. When I bought a house, I chose one in a neighborhood that would be easy to rent if I needed to relocate for work. When I took on major clients, I always ensured that no single client represented more than 40% of my revenue. The most sophisticated application came when I was negotiating a potential acquisition of my consulting practice by a larger firm called Strategic Dynamics. Their CEO, Jennifer Walsh, was offering an attractive deal that would have provided financial security and access to bigger clients. But instead of accepting immediately or rejecting outright, I used the negotiation period to develop two other potential paths. I explored partnerships with complementary consultants and investigated opportunities to expand my practice into new geographic markets. Having genuine alternatives completely changed the negotiation dynamic. Jennifer could sense that I wasn't desperate to sell, which made her offer more generous terms to ensure I'd accept. But more importantly, the process of developing alternatives helped me clarify what I actually wanted from my career. I ultimately decided to remain independent, but structured a strategic partnership with Strategic Dynamics that gave me access to their resources without giving up my autonomy. This approach extended beyond just career decisions. When I was house hunting, I always had backup properties identified before making offers, which gave me confidence to negotiate harder on my preferred choice. When planning vacations, I'd research multiple destinations and keep flexible bookings so I could optimize based on weather, availability, or changing interests. In every significant decision, I tried to maintain at least two viable paths forward. The psychological benefit was as important as the practical advantage. Knowing I had options reduced anxiety and increased confidence in a way that improved my performance across all areas. When you're not desperate for any particular outcome, you can think more clearly and negotiate more effectively. People can sense when someone has alternatives, and they treat that person with more respect and offer better terms. But perhaps the most valuable insight was recognizing that options aren't just about having backup plans, they're about maintaining the ability to pivot toward better opportunities as they emerge. The goal isn't just protection against downside risks, but positioning for upside possibilities that you can't predict or plan for in advance. Having multiple paths open meant I could respond quickly when unexpected opportunities appeared. The challenge was learning to balance option creation with focused execution. You can't pursue every possibility simultaneously without diluting your effectiveness, but you also can't focus so narrowly that you miss important changes in your environment. The key was maintaining what I started calling strategic awareness, keeping enough peripheral vision to spot emerging opportunities while staying focused on current priorities. This multi-option mindset had become so fundamental to how I approached major decisions that I almost couldn't imagine operating any other way. But I was about to discover that having multiple options was just the foundation for an even more crucial skill, knowing how to maintain whatever success you achieved once you built it. Machiavelli warned that conquering is easy, maintaining is difficult. The true prince is one who remains in power when fortune turns against him. I discovered the truth of this during what should have been the pinnacle of my consulting career in Seattle in 2023. After 5 years of building my independent practice, I'd finally achieved everything I thought I wanted. A roster of high-paying clients, a team of talented contractors, and a reputation as one of the top strategy consultants in the Pacific Northwest. But success, I learned, creates its own set of problems that are much more complex than the challenges of getting there in the first place. The first warning sign came when I noticed that client calls were becoming routine rather than exciting. I was solving the same types of problems I'd solved dozens of times before, and while my solutions were effective, they weren't innovative anymore. My biggest client, Northwest Manufacturing, had been working with me for 3 years, and their new CEO, Amanda Torres, made an offhand comment during a quarterly review that really stuck with me. She said, "David, your work is always solid, but I'm wondering if we need some fresh perspectives on our strategic challenges." That comment hit me harder than any direct criticism ever had. I realized I'd fallen into what I now call the success trap. I was delivering consistent value based on proven approaches, but I wasn't evolving or bringing new insights to the table. My competitors were younger, hungrier, and approaching problems with methodologies I hadn't bothered to learn because my existing approaches worked fine. I was coasting on past accomplishments while the market was quietly moving beyond me. The wake-up call intensified when I lost a major contract to a boutique firm I'd never even heard of. Pacific Coast Logistics, a client I'd assumed was locked in for years, decided to try working with Adaptive Strategy Group, a team of consultants who specialized in AI-powered operational optimization. Their founder, Jessica Chen, was 10 years younger than me and was bringing tools and perspectives that made my traditional analysis look dated. I wasn't losing because I was bad at my job. I was losing because I'd stopped getting better at my job. I spent that weekend doing something I hadn't done in years, genuinely studying my competition and emerging trends in the consulting industry. I discovered that while I'd been perfecting my existing skill set, the entire field had evolved around artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and agile transformation methodologies. I was like a master craftsman in a world that had moved to industrial manufacturing. My expertise was still valuable, but it wasn't cutting edge anymore. The solution required something much more difficult than learning new techniques. It required fundamentally changing how I thought about my professional identity. Instead of being the expert who had all the answers, I needed to become the expert who asked better questions and synthesized insights from multiple sources. I enrolled in advanced courses on machine learning applications in business strategy, not because I wanted to become a data scientist, but because I needed to understand how these tools could enhance rather than replace strategic thinking. More importantly, I started hiring contractors who were stronger than me in specific areas. Instead of trying to master every new methodology myself, I built a network of specialists in emerging fields and positioned myself as the conductor who could orchestrate their expertise toward comprehensive solutions. This approach required swallowing my ego and admitting that my value wasn't in knowing everything, but in knowing how to combine the right knowledge for each unique situation. The transformation was visible within 6 months. When Northwest Manufacturing's Amanda Torres brought up her desire for fresh perspectives, I was ready with a proposal that combined traditional strategic analysis with predictive modeling and organizational psychology insights from 3 different specialists. Instead of defending my existing approach, I'd evolved it into something more sophisticated and comprehensive. Amanda was impressed not just with the new capabilities, but with my willingness to continuously improve rather than rest on past successes. The most powerful validation came when Jessica Chen, the consultant who'd beaten me for the Pacific Coast Logistics contract, reached out to propose a collaboration. She discovered that while her AI tools were sophisticated, she lacked the strategic thinking and client relationship skills that came from years of experience. We structured a partnership where her firm provided the analytical horsepower, and mine provided the strategic framework and client management. Together, we could offer capabilities that neither firm could match independently. This partnership taught me the most important lesson about maintaining success. It's not about protecting what you've built, but about continuously rebuilding it before circumstances force you to. The clients and capabilities that made me successful 5 years ago were different from what I needed for the next 5 years. Adaptation couldn't be reactive. It had to be proactive and ongoing. I started treating my business like a startup that needed to reinvent itself every 18 months, rather than an established practice that could coast on proven methods. I began applying this reinvention principle to my personal life as well. Instead of letting my fitness routine become stale, I regularly changed workout programs and learned new sports. Instead of reading only business books in my area of expertise, I explored psychology, neuroscience, and even fiction to develop broader perspectives. Instead of socializing only within my professional network, I joined community organizations and hobby groups that exposed me to different worldviews and challenges. The pattern became clear. Maintaining any form of success requires the same energy and innovation that created it originally. Whether it's professional reputation, personal relationships, or financial security, everything decays without continuous renewal and improvement. The moment you start coasting on past achievements is the moment you begin the inevitable slide toward irrelevance. But perhaps the most sophisticated insight was recognizing that true maintenance of power isn't about defending your current position. It's about anticipating where power will shift next and positioning yourself to benefit from those changes rather than resist them. The most successful people I knew weren't those who fought against industry evolution, but those who studied it carefully and figured out how to ride the waves of change rather than be crushed by them. This perspective completely changed how I viewed competition and disruption. Instead of seeing new players like Jessica as threats to be defeated, I started seeing them as sources of intelligence about where the market was heading. Instead of dismissing new methodologies because they challenged my expertise, I evaluated them as potential tools for expanding my capabilities. Maintenance of power required constant learning, strategic partnerships, and the humility to evolve rather than entrench. Looking back, I realized that learning these 12 principles wasn't just about becoming more effective in business or relationships. It was about developing a fundamentally different way of thinking about influence, power, and success. Machiavelli understood that the world is constantly changing, and those who thrive are those who understand human nature deeply enough to adapt their strategies while maintaining their core principles. The game never ends, but once you understand the rules, you can play it with confidence, integrity, and remarkable effectiveness.